everyone, thank you so much for coming to Community Energy Wales' webinar on community low carbon heat. I'm going to get right into today's plan. So first of all, it's going to be an introductory presentation from me looking at why we're doing this, what are some of the challenges and opportunities for low carbon community heating, and a little bit about heat use in Wales. And then we're going to have presentations from 5 different people involved in community projects in some way, shape or form, which I'm really looking forward to. Then hopefully at the end we'll have time for a short Q&A, and then I will give you some details for our working group that is going to be launched from this. More information will come about that at the end. So why are we having this event? First off, as I will highlight in the coming slides, there is a real need to push for more low carbon heating, and community heating is a great way to do this. Pushing for low carbon heating is an essential part of meeting net zero targets and a way to tackle fuel poverty at the same time. We're specifically having this event and launching a working group as a way to share knowledge and overcome barriers from the sector. And we're also having this event to launch Community Energy Wales' heat working group, which, as I said, we'll have more information about at the end of the webinar. So looking into heat use in Wales, on the right here we have a lovely old pie showing the total energy use in Wales in 2019. As you can see, heat use is a pretty significant chunk of this pie. 40% of energy used in Wales is used to heat homes, businesses, and also used in industry. And while in generation terms and community energy, we mostly focus on this little electricity part of the pie, which is still very important to tackle. It is quite small in comparison to heat, which kind of gives you an idea of why heat is a big barrier to overcome when it comes to reaching net zero targets. So the majority of heat in Wales does come from gas, but there are large parts of Wales off the gas grid using things like oil, LPG, and electric heating. Tackling heat is a key part of tackling climate change, which also offers opportunities to tackle issues such as fuel poverty and other community issues. And this is a point I will keep harping on about. But heat use is very different to electricity, as I will show you in the next slide. This is daily gas consumption in Wales in 2020, which gives you a pretty good idea of what the daily heat use is like. So there's general base use here from things like our hot water and also industrial use, but there's a very big spike in winter. And as you can see in October here, end of September, beginning of October, where we are right now, is kind of where everyone starts putting their heating on. So what can low carbon heating look like? I'm not going to go into too much detail in any of these technologies. That could be an entire webinar in and of itself. But just to give you an idea of what some low carbon heating can look like. Generally, there's a mix of these things, like you can have heat pumps with district heating, solar mixed with heat pumps, you can have biomass or waste heat mixed in with district heating. And I'm sure some of our community presenters today will talk a bit about the technology used in their schemes. But yeah, this is just to give you an idea of all the ways you can do things not using fossil fuels. And this quote is from Regen's Local Delivery of Clean Heat, stating that a local approach to decarbonising heat is the most effective way to bring down bills and cut carbon. So just adding on to that point again, tackling the energy crisis and the climate crisis, which are pretty interlinked, but the energy price crisis at the same time. So what are some of the positives and wins of using community low carbon heating? Well, first of all, you get heat delivered directly to home. You can do this in a hyper-local way. Unlike with the grid at the moment, where it's incredibly difficult, although we are hoping to change this in the future, incredibly difficult to sell your electricity locally. It goes into the grid and then it's brought back out of the grid with no power, with very little power to change much of that, unless you're going for very direct wire. Heat is both created and delivered hyper-locally, so it works very well with a community scheme. Secondly, at this point again, you can tackle fuel poverty and the climate crisis at the same time. Thirdly, it's an opportunity to pioneer and pilot schemes in Wales. This is also a little bit of a challenge, but it can really help put certain communities on the map, and it's an exciting way to pave the way forward for low carbon community heating. There are also opportunities to learn from other community schemes, as we're doing in today's webinar, and hopefully we'll in the working group. One of my favourite things about working in community energy is that general willingness of organisations who are a bit more established, helping those that are trying to get going. And there's also a real opportunity here to increase public awareness and knowledge around heating. People are used to just turning on their gas boiler or their oil boiler or whatever and heating their homes. Most people aren't really aware of what options there are in terms of low carbon heating, how to access them, etc. So it's a really great opportunity to start bridging that gap. And knowledge is power, and putting that out there. On the right here, as I talked about before, there are large parts of Wales with a gap not on the gas grid. So if you look at certain counties, you've got just over 25% of homes on gas, but the majority of Wales has less than 90% of homes on the gas grid. So there's a special focus on these, I suppose, going forward. And just to give you an idea currently of what the sector looks like in terms of low carbon community heating, right now in Wales, community organisations own 27.5 megawatts of renewable electricity generation and only 363 kilowatts of low carbon heating. This is correct as of the State of Sector Report 2021. And in the UK as a whole, there are community organisations own 331 megawatts of renewable electricity generation, around 4.7 megawatts of low carbon heating. So in the UK as a whole, heat equates to less than 1.5% generation, although this is Welsh statistic, being 40% of consumption, and a similar value in the UK as a whole. So we have work to do here to change this, but a real opportunity to at the moment. And what are some of the reasons for this? What are some of the challenges of low carbon community heating? Well, heat use is highly seasonal, so it's quite different to model compared to electricity, but this is overcome by many people doing things. These two next points are kind of linked into each other. So there has been historically and currently a lack of policy and government support when it comes to low carbon heating. It might be on the agenda, but not very far up the agenda, or mentioned sort of in footnotes of things, or only just starting to be pushed to the forefront. And this can mean limits in the amount of grant funding, especially specifically for community heat projects. There's high installation costs for a lot of these projects, which makes it really inaccessible for individual homeowners, but can also be a barrier for community as well. There's also limited public knowledge and awareness, so bridging that gap and getting communities involved can be an issue, also an opportunity to be discussed. I'm sure some of our community organisations talking today will talk about how they've overcome some of these barriers and engage their local communities. And there's also a lack of existing schemes in Wales to learn from. We're slightly behind the curve of our neighbours, but even in the UK as a whole, it's still sort of in the beginning stages, a lot of these low carbon heating. But that's why we're here today, to learn, and that just about wraps up my portion of this talk. I am now delighted to hand over to Awel Fletcher from the Swaffham Prior Heat Network.
Everyone, right, I have the delight in sharing to you the project here in Swaffham Prior. So by way of background, I'm the chair of a community land trust, but also by day I happen to work for a development company as well. So I've put my skill set to good use in my own personal village. So taking through, there we go. So this is me. Where's Swaffham Prior? So it's a little way off from Wales. We're over to the east of the country. We sit just north of Cambridge. We are a community of about 300 homes. We have 2 churches. We have a large conservation area. We have a number of listed properties. We have over 45 affordable homes in the key sort of area of the village of about 200 homes. And fundamentally, we're a community reliant on oil. The pub, which is just about going, we've got 2 windmills, pretty much a rural community, a very small school with half-form entry. We did used to have a train station, and we have a water tower, and that's about pretty much what we're famed for. But one of the things we do have, that our buildings reflect the age of the village, and we have an awful lot of old buildings, and our demographics are such that most of the population is over 55, and we are literally an aging village. So we set up the Community Land Trust. The Community Land Trust came together to build some new homes for our community and to build some much needed bungalows for those people that need them, together with air source heat pumps. And on the back of that, we decided we were going to tackle what are we going to do to take the village off oil. We wanted to make sure that energy to households was the same or lower than the cost of oil. It provided a more stable energy price, so you're not spending your time worrying whether it's 25 pence a litre or 120 pence a litre. In terms of the oil, and no upfront costs, no barriers to entry. Literally anybody, wealthy, poor, affordable housing, private, rented, anybody could join this project. And basically we wanted to take the rural retrofit out of the too hard to do category. So in terms of those who it's going to benefit, those relying on oil, we also have some people on electric, but those who wanted to reduce their energy costs, people that couldn't afford to make them upfront capital investment to improve it, and actually improve air quality, reduce pollution, and future-proof the village, not just from the sustainability point of view, but to make sure young people keep coming to our village and live in our village and making it a thriving community. So we'll quickly whip through the funding. It started back in December 2017, and we, the community, got £20,000 from the Rural Community Energy Fund. And we did that and used that money just to do a quick swoop, what might be available to us. We then partnered up with the county council and we went forward for another funding round, and we got £40,000, which was match funded by our effectively county council and the combined authority. We then got a further round, next stage on, to do some borehole testing and really test all of our thoughts on the project. That was £100,000 matched by the county council with 30. And basically we worked out what could we be doing on the project in terms of borehole testing, our thermal baseline, and what energy sources were out there for us as a community.
Who's putting it on?
Roll it forward. We then got further money to take it forward to a planning and development stage, and work with the community to draw up legal agreements. We did project management, community liaison, and then finally last year we received 3.268 million from HNDU in order to bring the project forward for commercialisation. So what did we do? So basically what we have done is we decided that we didn't want anything that involved fossil fuels. So having utilised the money to test for boreholes, we have now got the first village scale retrofit project in the UK. It's price matched to oil, and what we have done is used a combination of technologies. So we have 108 boreholes that go 200 metres deep that provide ground source closed loop system, combined with an industrial air source from Denmark. And the idea is that we use the air source in summer and we use the ground source in winter once the ground has regenerated. And we also have a private wire that goes to an off-site solar farm owned by the county council. We've also, what we have been doing is we've been monitoring the community homes, 5 different house types for 2.5 years. And we know that we need to ensure that the homes can get 72 degrees to their home to work with all existing heat radiator systems in the home. So we what was not available to us is what was our base load, what temperature did we need to get to. And the groundbreaking thing about this project, my understanding is the 72 degrees. And this week, we've actually just on air source alone proved in testing that we've got to the 75 degree level, which we need to go around the village. So these are the boreholes going in. We're not fracking, we're not, deep well boring or anything like this. These are our boreholes going in. They're 20 metres apart to stop them from individually causing each other to get permafrost. And they'll be rotated through on series. They're 80 centimetres below the ground, and the field will go back to the offset field it was for nitrogen offset. These are industrial air pumps. We've got 3 of them. One's a backup, and they also have a bed of fans outside. The biggest headache has been laying the network through the village. You can see we've got existing services, some of which we knew about, some of which we didn't, but we have literally put a spine of water pipes through the village that takes the hot water out at 72, 75 degrees, and it returns it back to the energy centre. Literally all it is well insulated pipes, hot water in the road. We've caused utter chaos, I'm not going to lie, with the temporary traffic lights. We have a bypass road and a road through the village. If anybody drove through the lights and they went red, it turned all the traffic lights to red as a safety feature, but we caused a 5.5 mile tailback one day. It is disruptive putting it in, but now we've got through that headache and the network is in. Guess what? Memories are very short and everybody's now forgotten. But there is a physical scarring on the community that has to happen to get this pipe network in. This is the old barn that we had previously on the site that we thought we could convert but couldn't. But this is the new replacement building, pretty much the same, but a brand new agricultural building. And these are our thermal stores that go in. So we had a long discussion about backup. Do we use wood chip? Do we use other fossil fuels to back it up in terms of an oil boiler? And actually we realized, you know what, if we just have 4 thermal stores of hot water, when we need it, we can call upon it. So these are now our 4 installed hot stores, and this is the fan bed linked to the industrial air source. So if we're honest with ourselves, it will just look like a normal agricultural building with some silos on the outside to anybody going past. For each home, they're going to get a heat interface unit. So we're whipping out their oil boiler, we're whipping out their oil tank, taking out a huge amount of infrastructure out of the village. And then this tiny little heat interface unit will go on the wall of people's homes. There's a standing charge depending on the size and number of bedrooms in your property, and then a unit price that's been matched to 40 pence a litre for oil that moves with indexation. We've worked at length with residents. We've literally taken the heat interface unit around the village showing people. We've done walks, we've done talks, we've done leaflets, we've done flyers, we've done website. And we've also worked very hard with our housing association residents and 2 housing associations in the village. And all of those homes will eventually join up to the system, and the pipe networks are going in, and we're changing those as and when we have the ability to do so in line with their tenancy agreements. For us as a village, it's a huge impact because we're changing together. We believe we're going to save over 1,000 tonnes of carbon a year annually. We're going to reduce oil deliveries. We're going to allow people to actually budget properly for the cost of their fuel. We believe it will be cheaper for a lot of the community as well. And for us in Cambridgeshire, we are just a small village, but there's at least another 10,000 homes that can benefit with a project of this nature. But it hasn't been easy. And from a community point of view, you'd think that everybody would love this, but lots of people are really, really reticent to do anything different and change. And that's been probably the biggest learning thing. People think because they've gone to a green energy provider, that's their bit. The air source heat pumps would all work on the house, but they won't because of the age of most of the properties. And therefore it has been quite a challenge. We've had lots of Facebook page comments we've had to go back on. You know, we've had to, you know, take jokes at ourselves, like, you know, we're not responsible for the blue sign the community are whinging about on the road. We're not responsible for Anglia Water doing their works. And at the end of the day, we weren't responsible for the results of one of the Euro football matches. But we have taken quite a lot of blame for all these things. But the long and the short of it is the community really don't understand what's coming to them. The language used is not correct. Who knew that actually the government is now talking about removing all oil tanks, new, old, retrofit, new build from 2026. So for oil communities in particular, we've got a problem. So we've worked lots with people. We're very willing to have people round. We've done a lot on education. We've worked with 4 other villages who are now on their journey. This is Brian from Heath Upper Hayford, who comes down to see me a lot. And at the end of the day, you know, we are now moving forward. We're about to go online. And if anybody wants to come and see us, get involved, yeah, my details are on the QR code or send me an email. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. As I've said, if anyone has any questions through any of the presentations, feel free to add them in the chat, and we will hopefully get to them all during the Q&A. Next up, I will introduce Rebecca Cadbury, who is from Nartbeth Energy Limited, who set up a low carbon heating system for their local pool in an attempt to save their local pool. Hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me along, Izzy, to talk. I'm afraid I don't have a set of elaborate slides, but I'll run you through basically why NEL was set up in the first place, what we do, which is quite a limited project really, and I thought it might be useful to just again highlight some of the kind of learning that's gone on during the process. So Nell was set up because in 2014, the Pembrokeshire County Council was faced with a need for cuts right across their budget. And so they selected to, made a decision that they wished to close our local swimming pool in Nartbeth. Now, Nartbeth is a small town of about 1,500 residents tops, and it covers a bigger area of the pool. It's quite a small community pool, as part of a school at one stage. But nevertheless, teaches a lot of school children, and there was a very active over 55 swimming club and a lot of other clubs and regular resident use. So there was a feeling in the community that they really didn't want to see their pool close. And we were, basically the community was faced with the need to produce a business plan very quickly. We had a very fixed deadline by which, if we hadn't produced a plan, the council would go ahead and close it, and that would be the end of the matter. Previous experience showed that once the pools were closed and emptied, that was it. You couldn't get them back. So a grant was obtained from the Waterloo Trust to put together a business plan, and the business plan was based on cutting, essentially cutting expense in terms of staff by using volunteers to help run the pool, and also by introducing a renewable heating system which would take advantage of the heat incentive, renewable heat incentive at that time. So it was a part of the plan was that part of the project would be actually slightly separate from the actual pool itself. So Swim Nartbeth has been set up as a charity to run the pool, and we are we were set up as Nartbeth Energy Limited, which is a community interest company with shareholders recruited from the local population mainly, and we also obtained grants. So the funding, the project was for us to buy a biomass boiler, which had to be housed separate from the pool in a container, which would then supply heat to the pool at a lower cost than oil, using the renewable heat incentive. It was very tough because we had to, in order to get the maximum renewable heat incentive, we had to get the whole project up and running in about 2 months altogether. We launched the share offer on the 4th of October, and we had to have the biomass commissioned, though not absolutely complete, but commissioned by the 31st of December. So it was very, very tight schedule. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, in retrospect, it was quite a difficult time. And I think there were some things that mistakes were in. It's perhaps wrong to say mistakes, but things that could have been done better if we'd had a little bit more time to research and to plan. So Nell's now been providing heat for the pool. We've obviously had quite a difficult 2 years because the pool's been closed for a lot of that time over COVID. And at the moment, obviously, we're also facing quite an increase in the cost of pellets, which is causing some financial concerns at the moment for the pool. But I think we feel that Nell has managed to, in effect, buffer some of those effects on Nartbeth, Swim Nartbeth, on the pool itself. And that has enabled us to continue to have a community pool, swimming pool in what is a quite small community. And I think that in itself is a huge achievement. in terms of the figures, obviously our figures are a great deal smaller. We raised about 110,000 in shares. We have managed to, we were very clear that we needed to build up a contingency. So we successfully did that, and that has been very important. It's allowed us to buy back shares, particularly on the death of some of the people who contributed originally. We don't have a legal obligation to buy back shares, but people from the community gave their money, and we've tried where we can to always do that. And it's also enabled us to actually change our boiler, because we had quite a lot of problems with our initial choice of boiler. And that's happened in the last year. And that's, I think, you know, we felt, I think our original sort of conservatism in terms of making sure that we were making enough money from our renewable heat incentive and what we charged the pool to allow us to build up a contingency fund is really important in terms of our long term, being able to continue in the long term. So I think just quickly, what I thought I'd just raise was, I think some of the difficulties and issues that arise in small communities. I have to say, hats off to that enormous project in Cambridge, because I think they've done really, really well. But I think personnel is one of the things that you need to think about, because it is true that with small communities, it's often a smallish group of people who take action and do things. And there is both the risk that those people become unwell, burn out, move. So there's a real sense of needing to, I suppose, think about how you're going to future-proof the project in terms of personnel, as well as, and volunteers, as well as financially future-proofing the project. I think the other thing I would mention is contingencies. So again, you know, our experience with having a boiler that became very unreliable and needing changing, was important to think about financial contingencies. But I think that one of the reasons why we had problems with the biomass boiler that we had was that actually we didn't have a very robust ongoing support system technically with the boiler. And when we chose our new boiler, that's one of the most important things that I've looked at, was not repeating that mistake, making sure that whatever the firm that we used to purchase and install the new boiler were going to provide continuing ongoing support and actually be a locally based company that therefore felt very invested in the whole project. I think those probably cover most of the things that I think that we learnt from this project. I think the only other thing I would raise, which I think is an interesting area, and is that obviously with the community heat project, we recognise that although in theory renewable heat is separate from the energy market, because of the way the energy market works in this country, and because of the fact that a lot of, in terms of wood pellet boilers, heat is, a lot of that is imported from elsewhere, the price that you pay is related to the fossil fuel market. It is not completely independent of that. And so obviously we have seen rises in the cost of pellets over the last year. I think it's gone up about 3 times in cost. No, twice. It's about twice as expensive now as it was last winter. And we've had to look very carefully at trying to ensure that there are good efficiency gains, and that there's also, you know, you're still conserving heat and not kind of, you know, it's not biomass in the barn generating heat in order to get money back from the government. It's got to be carefully used. Okay.
Amazing, thank you so much, Rebecca. This was originally a time we were going to take a break, but we are running a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'm thinking we have our next speaker and then take a 5-minute break, if that is okay with our next speaker, Kate. Kate is from Net Zero Hub Northwest, and I believe is going to talk to us about a number of different projects.
Great, thanks very much, Izzy. Right, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Great, okay. Yes, thanks, Izzy. I work for the Northwest Net Zero Hub. My background's renewable energy consultancy, but I've been involved in community energy for a long time. And I've been delivering the Rural Community Energy Fund across the Northwest. So a lot of the projects I'm going to run through have had funding via RCEF. And as Emma mentioned, that was how the Swaffham Prior project was seeded as well. So in terms of low carbon heat, we've been working on 5 different projects. I'm going to particularly talk about chipping, which is around rural delivery model, and then a project in Bakeup, which is looking at net zero terrace street, and that's obviously an more urban delivery model as well. But yeah, first inspiration. I mean, Emma's just inspired us all, and Emma's been pretty much the inspiration for the work we've been doing in the Northwest. It's a fantastic project at Swaffham Prior, and when I first started in this role, I looked at that project and thought, right, how can we get something else along those lines happening in the Northwest? Other projects of inspiration were the project that Brighton and Hove Energy Service Company, Bahesco, were doing in a village in Firle. They were looking at kind of a heat as a service project with Fabric First, extension of an existing biomass network and shared ground loop. Obviously, Emma's just said about the Swaffham Prior project, borehole array with the energy centre, the insulated heat network, the heat exchangers replacing oil boilers in each home, and then obviously the private wire to solar farm as well. Another inspirational project that we looked at is Communiheat, which is at a village in Barkham in Sussex. And their starting point was all about grid reinforcement and the cost of unplanned net zero journey versus planned net zero journey. So they work with UK Power Networks to say, if we all do our own thing in this rural village that's off the gas grid, how much is it going to cost you to reinforce the grid? And UK Power Networks came back and said, oh, we think about 15 million. And then they said, well, okay, if we work collectively and we do this in a planned way, what's it going to cost you? And they came back and said, oh, about 3 million. So there's a real saving in those avoided costs in grid reinforcements, which are really hard to put on a balance sheet. But again, it's something we should be thinking about in terms of our network capacity, especially in rural areas. The last project that we've been looking really closely at is this Kenza Heath Streets project down in Scythians in Cornwall. They've got ERDF funding and they're looking at a cluster shared ground loop, and their model is, or their payback of the infrastructure cost is based on a standing charge model. And they've got big funding, or they're backed by Legal and General as Kenza Utilities. So again, we've been looking at their delivery model. And I think what's interesting about the Scythians project is their speed of delivery. I think they only approached the village in March last year, and as you see from this picture, they're already on site. I think in part that's because they don't have an energy centre, which will obviously need planning permission. As Emma mentioned, there's obviously other consents, especially around things like going in highways. However, without the energy centre and this kind of cluster approach, I think the speed of delivery is something that is notable. So in terms of the Northwest projects, we started out with the chipping project. And as I say, that was really inspired by Swaffham Prior. So I went and looked for a village where I thought they might be interested to actually look at the Swaffham project and see how that could translate to working in their community. It's off the gas grid. It's really like Swaffham, approximately 300 houses, fairly high density. We've not got a trunk road dissecting the village. So in terms of disruption and digging in the streets, I thought it might be less assessment issue. And we started off with the Rural Community Energy Fund stage 1. And really that was about, sorry, I'll go back one. Really that was about ruling out what the community didn't want and what we didn't think would work. And the stage 1, we looked at a Swaffham type solution, looking at land for borehole array and an energy centre. But we then decided that land ownership was going to be a big issue. Finding somewhere to put an energy centre was going to be a big issue. And the community group weren't confident that it was a solution that their community would get on side with. So at that point, we kind of pivoted and started working on a solution similar to Scythian's. And down in the left-hand corner, that's what that kind of solution looks like. It's boreholes, as Emma said, you know, kind of 200 metres deep, but they're shared among a cluster of houses between 5 and 15, which means that the work we're doing at the moment is looking at interest, we're looking at doing detailed energy audits, and we're looking to find these first clusters that we can make a start with. In terms of where we're up to with this, we're on stage 2 Rural Community Energy Fund, and we're trying to work the project towards the Green Heat Network Fund. This is a central government fund. I think it's about 270 million. It's open till 2025. It has a minimum requirement for rural areas of 100 houses if you're not on the gas grid. It's 150 houses if you are on the gas grid. One of the issues we found, again, talking about grid constraints, is the solution at Chipping had to be within the constraints of the local grid, which is 2 megawatts. And the solution we're looking at, we think, can be done within that constraint. One of the kind of engagement questions with Chipping at the outset of the journey is, why do we need a community solution? And I think the key is inclusivity. And then there's other things such as grid capacity, but also it's looking at the business model and the rollout. As Emma said, you know, they're looking at 1,000 tons of carbon, all taken, everyone's kind of having the opportunity to come off oil at the same time. And that was very much the message at Chipping. If we have a piecemeal approach, we're not going to get those carbon savings as fast as we need to. In terms of delivery, I thought it's really interesting that Chipping has already had broadband, and they've got broadband through Barn, which is broadband for rural north. And Barn really stepped up and helped communities, rural communities, get broadband in where the big boys weren't going to go because it wasn't economic. They are a community benefit society. And they work with communities very much like community energy groups, and they raise gap funding through community share issue. That project is based on the Rural Gigabit voucher scheme that's run by Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And I'm really keen to suggest to BEIS that we have something similar for rural, a rural gigawatt voucher scheme. It's worked for broadband rollout. You know, can we push BEIS to say, well, look, you know, here's a delivery model that worked for broadband. Low carbon heat is very similar in terms of rollout to broadband. And it's a really good handy reference point because it's not that far in our distant past that we kind of remember that rollout. So trying to copy delivery models that have worked already, I think, is an important point. In terms of governance, we're still trying to resolve issues around, well, who will own this infrastructure in this rural setting? It so happens that Chipping, they have a community land trust. They also have the Brabants Trust, which was an endowment trust from 1684. So they're very familiar with kind of legacy trusts and creating benefit that will have a long-term benefit for the community. Again, we're looking at the standing charge model. Emma mentioned they have standing charge model at Swaffham, but also they sell heat. We're looking at ambient shared ground loops, so we're not selling heat, we're just connecting people to ambient water. So we'd just be based on a model that looks at standing charge. And also, how do you actually afford the retrofit? You know, we need to try to bring down the energy consumption of houses at the same time. Community Heat, they're looking at a local authority bond. I'm working with Lendology, community interest company, to see whether they can offer finance to people who want to do retrofit. There's also a lot of work around green mortgages and property linked finance. But I think the key is that the solution has to be inclusive. Everybody has to be able to access finance to do retrofit if they so choose. But also we're looking at, can we actually apply that retrofit model and add it to the standing charge? So essentially layer debt onto infrastructure costs. And we're looking at that for a few projects. So in terms of chipping and next steps, we're currently doing 20 detailed energy audits. We've had 100+ surveys completed, and a lot of community engagement, and we seem to have broadly a supportive community. We're trying to create these clusters through looking at interest and demand, and we're going to be progressing to Green Heat Network Fund as well. Highways is a big outstanding issue, and we're still working on things like governance. Looking at an urban area, this is another project that we're doing through the Community Renewal Fund. And I think key really is looking at the rows and rows of terrace houses where air source heat pumps are not going to be an appropriate solution, either because of space constraints or because of things like noise. I mean, as you can see from the picture, houses got really small backyards. Air source heat pumps are quite a big piece of kit. You know, you have bikes propped up against them, or they're susceptible to damage, footballs, kids, etc. And it's an expensive piece of kit. You want them to work at maximum efficiency, and if they've got things propped against them, they're not going to be as efficient, which will mean that households will pay more for their energy. So again, we're looking at kind of a community solution using shared ground loop here as well. The key about the net zero terrace street is we're really trying to understand what is going to be replicable and therefore scalable. So what is a baseline model? So that needs a technical solution, and ideally one that's going to work within the constraints of a substation. Because if you can find a technical solution that can be replicated without having to go back to basics and looking at the grid capacity, then you've got that kind of baseline where you can roll it out. So we're looking at the shared ground loop with the individual heat pumps in the house. Also shared solar, so solar across the whole terrace street, and rather than each solar having being wired into an individual home, it's called Sol Share, and you wire it all in behind the meters, and it means that any generation is consumed across the terrace street rather than going to grid. So you consume a much more of the solar generation than you would in individual solutions. Also looking at things like smart thermal batteries or smart cylinders, which will give that local flexibility, buffering, etc., and overall smart local energy systems as well. A key part of any kind of scaling is engagement. You know, how do you reach hard to reach people? We've got some funding to look at a Fairer Warmth app. You know, if you look at traditional engagement, which might be door knocking, that's incredibly resource intensive. If you've done something to smooth the way by way of an app, which people have already downloaded, then it's easier to start in new areas and you can look for clusters, etc. The finance solution, it's got to be inclusive, it's got to be a homogeneous solution. You look at that row of terraced houses and you can't knock on the door and say, right, well, you'll need to get a green mortgage. Have you looked at property linked finance? You know, a heat as a service where it's stacked on top of a standing charge, or some type of solution where people can tick and say, yes, I'd like a bronze retrofit package, please, for my house. And yes, I'm happy for it to sit on a standing charge. And it's all about speed of delivery, because with the speed of delivery, you'll get the scale of delivery as well. But underneath it all, the low carbon heat has to be affordable. And I think that's where it's very tricky. Sorry, probably, Izzy, how long have I got? No minutes, okay. Right, I'll just very quickly just look at this balance. Basically, at the moment, people have got their gas and electricity spend, and that's their annual energy spend. And we've got to balance this equation when we move to new models. You know, how does this balance? We've got to squeeze money out of local generation, flexibility market through smart local energy solutions. We've also got to reduce the overall energy demand of the house through retrofit. And we're going to be adding a standing charge if we're looking at this infrastructure cost. So how's that balance out? I think Izzy will share these slides with you because I've probably gone right over. I think if people can, I've put some links in there. I think if people have any questions, I've highlighted quite a lot of things that we all need to. I mean, Izzy's obviously got plans to do a working group, and it would be great to take some of these topics forward in working group discussions, because we're all trying to find our way and pathfind. And it's great to hear what Emma's done, and it's how we actually take success stories and then transpose those onto new communities. So yeah, happy to follow up with anybody and look forward to working in the working group. Thanks, Izzy.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, any slides will be sent out afterwards for people to read over, and that brings us nicely onto a little break before we introduce Dan McCallum. There we go. I'm seeing a camera and
I know there was something very strange going on my laptop, so my interview. So I'm going to speak in Welsh, if that's okay. Fi'n credu mai cyfieithu ar y pryd oddi wrth Paul. Eitho pawb gallu clywed fi, os rhywun gallu neud a thumbs up. Bydd yn iawn, right, wych, Kate wedi neud e. So dyma'r just y llun o'r Hwb y Gwrs, hen ysgol Cwm Gwrs, ble, wel, fi'n byw agos ato fe. Fi'n gweithio I elusen Awel am Tawe, a ni wedi wneud 2 cooperatives, un fferm wynt, Awel, ac wedyn cooperative hael, paneli hael, paneli solar, egni co-op. And just diddordeb da fi yn yr gwres am y dyfodol, achos lot o ni yn byw yn y pentrefi sy'n cael y gwres oddi wrth yr olew. So just un prosiect fi'n siarad am yn Hwb y Gwrs, dyma'r gwres o'r ddeiar, pwmp o'r ddeiar, so a ground source heat pump. Just dim lot o brofiad yn ni, ond fi'n siarad tipyn bach amdano'r prosiect hyn, just fel couple o tips really. Ges I surprise bydd rhaid I ni wneud boreholes am y prosiect hyn. O'n i'n feddwl, achos ti'n gallu weld yr maes chwarae tu ôl yr ysgol, o'n i'n credu bydd hwn yn digon mawr am y slinkies, just trenches yn y ddeiar, ond ni wedi cael couple o quotes ar prosiect cwmni WDS o'r Caerdydd wedi, maen nhw wedi bod yn really dda, yn oedd nhw yn dweud bydd rhaid I ni gael boreholes. Just I dweud hefyd, oedd WDS ni wedi cael recommendation I defnyddio nhw o'r down to earth ar gwyr. So mae'n really worth siarad I bobl eraill sy'n wedi wneud prosiectau cyn ti'n sort of penderfynu, achos mae eitha lot o sharks mas myna nawr. So y prosiect wedi costi 90,000 o bunne. Ni wedi talu am oddi wrth cyfrandaliadau cymunedol, community shares o'r egni. Mae popeth mewn nawr, so fe'n wedi commissiono eto, fi'n credu bydd hwn yn barod mewn sort of fis nesa. Mae 12 o'r boreholes I wneud yr 50 kilowatt, 50 kilowatt system. O'n i'n feddwl am wneud 6, ond pan maen nhw wedi wneud yr sort of testing, no, not testing, but actual drilling, maen nhw wedi bwrw yr hen pwch glo Cwm Gwrs, so oedd rhaid nhw aros am 60 metres. And wedi clywed Kate yn dweud maen nhw'n wneud y sort of testing, and fydd yn bwysig iawn cyn ti wneud scheme mawr I wneud y testing, ond gyda ni, maen nhw'n gallu wneud desktop surveys a pethau, but mae ddim yn ddangos ble mae'r pwch glowe, sort of y shafts dros Cymru, sa'n credu. So dyma'r un o sort of, risks, and fel Nartbeth wedi dweud, mae'r bwysig I gael contingencies. Mae ddim wedi costi llawer I ni, ond mae wedi costi mwy, achos mae rhaid I ni wneud dwbl o'r rif yr boreholes, achos o'n ni'n feddwl am wneud yr boreholes am 120 metr yn dan y ddaear. Peth arall jyst i dweud, oedd yn cymleth gyda'r grid, gyda Western Power Distribution, DNO yn De Cymru. Yr grid yn wan yn yr ardal ni, so ni'n wedi dod i paneli ar y to yr ysgol hefyd. Mae grid limitation, ni'n dim ond gallu exporto 11 kilowatts o'r 90 kilowatts ar y to, achos yr grid mor wan. Ac hefyd i defnyddio yr gwres, so oedd rhaid i ni upgrado yr grid. So ni'n wedi cytuno i talu ambyti 20,000 o bunnau i upgrado'r grid. And then wedyn ni wedi cael lot o trafferth, just lot o emails rynto ni, achos y problem oedd i gael y grid upgrade, oedd rhaid i ni cael y caniatad wrth 2 landowners gyda tir Ffermwr. A maen nhw'n casau WPD, mae ddim wedi cytuno i wneud yr upgrade. Ar y diwedd y dydd, wel, bydd yn well probably i ni yn siarad i'r ffermwr i wneud y land search yn hunan. But yn y diwedd, ni wedi siarad eto a wedi cwyno lot gyda WPD, a maen nhw wedi dweud, oh no, mae solution arall ble sdim eisiau ti mynd ar y line newydd ar y tir private, ti'n gallu just mynd ar y highway, so bydd e'n costi llai ac mae just llai cymleth, dim eisiau gael, maen nhw'n gallu wneud y gwaith eu hunan ar y highway. Dyn ni ddim wedi cael y sort of sgwrs strategic gyda WT fel Kate wedi dweud. Fi'n credu, dyma'r problem, un o'r problemau gyda WPD yn y De Cymru. Mae lot o, maen nhw'n diddordeb gyda WPD yn y innovation, ond fi'n credu mwy o capacity dyn nhw yn yr south-west o'r Lloegr na Cymru. So dyma'r rhywbeth falle yn ei cymunedol Cymru i sort of wneud mwy o gwaith yn y dyfodol i gael mwy o discussion gyda WPD. Anyway, ni'n mynd i wneud ni'n wedi gael connection am y system, a mae'n mynd ymlaen. Just un pwynt hefyd, fi'n credu mae'n really bwysig i'r prosiectau fel hwn i gael yn M&E designer. So ni'n wedi defnyddio Quinn Ross, just i design o'r system i checo yr adeiladau and the energy audit and wedi cael ei wneud yn iawn. So fe'n rhywbeth yr prosiect, fel ni, fi'n gallu wneud energy audits, but dwi ddim yn qualified i wneud am yr gwres and size o'r systems gwres. So mae'n really bwysig ti'n cael y right safon o'r professional advice. So hwn wedi cael ei talu gan Cwmpas, y Wales Co-op Centre under professional advice schemes. Oedd hwn yn really defnyddiol. Yeah, so dyna un tip arall. Efallai bydd yn iawn i gael i linko tai preifat i'r system yn y dyfodol, ond bydd hwn yn sort of eisiau mwy o capacity, sort of, mae rhaid i ni edrych mewn i'r funding, but mae rhaid i ddau clywed am prosiectau arall sy'n neud yeah. So fi'n credu dyma popeth oedd i mwyn i dweud am y system. Diolch.
Diolch, Dan. And just a reminder for people who are on translation and want things in English to switch back and turn interpretation off now. And if Dan, you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great. Thank you very much. Amazing. So our next speaker was planning to be Toby from Crew Energy, but I am not who was arriving at around 12, but I'm not sure if he is here right now. He should be here. I've seen him. Oh, he is there. Okay, so I didn't see him come in. So yes, if everything's all right, I will hand over to Toby.
Hello, everybody. Sorry, I don't speak Welsh, so I have to do with English, I'm afraid. So I was just asked to speak, I think, for 5-10 minutes on the projects we're doing in London around heat. And our first project, I haven't presented any slides, so I'll just talk very quickly through what we did. We had funding from the Power to Change funds, which allowed us to look at renewable heat as a sort of next generation of community models, really. So it was all about developing things beyond solar PV on schools, on churches, using the feed-in tariff. What could community groups do next? And we focused on heat, and we looked at 3 areas, really. We looked at a civic centre. We looked at whether we could do some kind of communal heating system, and then the third one was trying to develop a domestic market. Yeah, in London there are 3.6 million homes. There are around about 5 heat pump companies. It's ridiculous. You know, there's a huge shortage of skills across the country, and so we thought, is there something we could do along those lines? So I'll just talk very quickly about each of those, and probably focus a little bit more on the civic centre. So we'd already been working with a civic centre called the Vast Club, which is a youth club in Battersea in southwest London, and that made it fairly easy for us because we had already installed LED lights, building management systems, destratifiers, second grazing. So we really had their buy-in. You know, we grant funded a lot of work for them. They were keen to decarbonise. They had their own targets on what they wanted to do. So they were a really good sort of target for us because they were pretty patient. We were pretty patient with them as well when it came to negotiating everything. And what we were trying to do at the time, there was still a non-domestic RHI available. So we were seeing if we could do a community share offer, fund that through the RHI. Plus, on top of that, we did need a heat payment from them. And they were locked into a very high at the time, not high anymore, obviously, gas contract, which meant the economics kind of worked out that way. So we ended up installing 4 NEB 2040 16 kilowatt heat pumps. So 64 kilowatts in total. And we're running in bivalence with the domestic boiler, because the domestic boiler is relatively new. We did this product in 2021, so I think the boiler was only 3 years old. And what that meant was it meant less upgrading of all the radiators. It also allowed us to kind of, as a first project, have a bit more trial and error really in what we were doing. We also installed a couple of 2,000 litre buffer tanks that at some stage, we haven't got to this yet, but we'd like to look at demand shifting and see if we can avoid 4-7. So if they have battery storage, they could shift their electricity demand, we could shift their heat demand for them through that period. So we'll be looking at that in the coming years. So we ended up with a deal with them over 20 years with the RHI, with I think it's a 1.5p payment for heat that they use. And then they can optimize. We've got a building management system already in there. So the building management system can optimize between the boiler and the heat pump, depending on outside temperature, the flow temperature of the heat pumps, and therefore the efficiency of heat pumps against the relative electricity and gas prices. We raised £50,000 for the project. I think the heat pumps themselves cost around about 42, 43. The buffers cost a bit more, and that gave us a sort of £5,000 buffer really, which we have had to need because our heat pump company went bust when they hadn't commissioned it properly. So we kind of lost some RHI in that period. But that was the model that we worked on. Clearly, the RHI is now gone. So we're working on 5 projects at the moment across London with various community groups and local businesses here in southwest London to install heat pumps. But it's very much grant-driven process now. So we're looking at how we can scope these projects, and we've used something called London Community Energy Fund, which allows us £15,000 up to of scoping budget. So we take, say, £3,000 of that, we go and scope the project, do all the heat loss calcs, get quotes from installers, and then we go and try and do a community fundraise or a grant funding operation to fund those heat pumps. And I think that's the model that we will go forward on. You know, we're kind of lucky, obviously, being in London. It's a huge, great building site most of the time. So there's quite a lot of CIL funding in the boroughs that we can tap into for this. The boroughs want to decarbonise, and air quality is a big issue in London. So actually investing in heat pumps is attractive on a couple of levels for them. So that's that project. The second one was much harder, and we actually still haven't achieved anything on this, but I think it's a really interesting area. And what we were looking at is putting communal heating into 3 blocks of flats. That was 52 flats in total. They're currently electrically heated, so we would have to put a whole wet system through the building. And then it was on the River Wandle, which is a tributary of the Thames. So we're going to have a water-to-water system, or we could have an air-to-water system. So we had 2 options really there. But we struggled actually because the landlord decided they weren't going to sell the property, the freehold to the tenants, and then that all got caught up in a big court case because they want to put 2 more stories on top. So the thing has died a death. But I think what it gave us an insight to though was the economics are kind of there for say privately owned properties. It's easier. We found it was really hard to deal with housing associations. So we were talking to Clarion, the largest in the UK, Moat Housing as well, and they both flatly rejected. We're starting to have conversations with Wandsworth Council now, but previous attempts have been rebuffed. We also spoke to Islington Council and Merton. Islington initially were really supportive, but then they realised that actually their own communal heating system was so bad they had to do something immediately, so they decided to fund the project themselves. So I think there's possible angles of working with the council because we're starting to see that traction. But I think this sort of where people have a share of a freehold is a really interesting area. The one problem you have is you can't have the boiler upgrade scheme, and we lobbied previously for RHI. We then lobbied for this scheme, and so did the Centre for Sustainable Energy. We're supporting us on this project, and we didn't really get anywhere. But I still think actually you get to the point where the economics are good enough, because if they've got 1-to-1 the electrical heating, in that example, then the savings are so large, then it's potentially very interesting for them. So it's something I think we'll come back to, but it's incredibly complex. Equally, I think community groups are pretty well set up for that, in that we do a lot of stakeholder outreach. We have a huge active home visit service at the moment for people in fuel poverty. So we're used to banging on doors and talking to people. So from that perspective, community groups can work very well with, say, 52 residents of a block of flats. You have to assess all those properties. They will have to have new EPCs. And again, lots of community groups have got people trained up with those skill sets of doing home assessments. We certainly have 3 or 4. So you can see the skill sets kind of work quite well in this communal thing. So I think more work needs to be done on it. And we think there is the potential to have a project of that type there. And then the final thing that we looked at was the domestic market. And we really need this because there's just no installers in London really at all. So we've come up with a hybrid model as a sort of starting point, where we've got a third party that's actually based down in Goring-on-Sea, which is about an hour and 20 minutes outside London. We found a local electricians stroke plumbers team. They've trained up to install Mitsubishi Ecodan heat pumps, which is what the Goring-on-Sea Goring-on-Sea team use. And then we've got people trained up to do heat loss assessments. So we kind of generate the leads. We go and do all the calculations, which means that people from Goring-on-Sea haven't come backwards and forwards to London the whole time. They do the design work. Then we put the whole package together and we look at who does what. So they'll do the design. We pass that on to our installers. They'll do the install. Then the Goring-on-Sea team will come up and sign off maybe a couple of projects at a time and say, okay, yep, they're both NTS accredited. So it's kind of a halfway house of us migrating towards maybe at some stage having our own team to do these installs. And we just thought it was a safer way. We're not on the hook with MCS. We're not heat pump company. We're not plumbers. We're not electricians. So you can kind of migrate yourself towards that slowly but surely. And we're just starting that partnership now. So we've got 3 projects that we've just priced up, and we're waiting for the clients to come back to see whether they're interested or not. So that's the approach we're taking here. We're working really closely with other community groups in London, so doing a bit of mentoring for them. So Power Up North London is one in Islington. We're working a project with them. We're working with Repowering, who are our next door neighbours in Brixton. and they've got projects in Tawe Hamlets and Barnet. We're working with them on. We're working with a civic centre up in Barnet as well. So we're trying to sort of share the skills that we've learned on this, so that other groups can kind of catch up and start developing these projects too. So I hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Toby. I think that leads us nicely into our Q&A. I know there were some questions in the chat that were answered. I know Emma was answering some questions. But if your question was unanswered, if you could put it in the chat again or put your hand up to ask a question. And we'll have about 10 minutes then for those to be answered. Give people a second to put them in the chat. Yeah, I think Compass, there's one question.
Sorry, yes, it's Alan Shepherd from Compass. I was just wondering whether anybody in the room knew how much of the legislation and funding opportunities that apply in England also apply in Wales. Be really helpful to know that, or to have someone pull together that work so we could have a look at that, and whether there's somebody from Welsh Government here today in the room. Thank you.
Mailer?
Just quickly, my understanding is that access to things like the HNDU fund it's open there for us in Wales, just in the same way as England, since it's not a devolved matter.
I'm going to assume that nobody else has anything to add to that point, but I will say that that is definitely something that Community Energy Wales can look into and talk to our government about, and something that we can talk about and explore more in the working group going forward, because yeah, it is quite confusing having that difference and knowing what funding is accessible here in Wales. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat as well. I've got a question from Duncan Burwood. I think this is to anyone who wants to answer, is how can we resolve the network access issue?
Maybe I'll jump in this one. Obviously, I'd put a link on there from Ofgem's decision on the 3rd of May on what they call the Access and Significant Code Review, which applies to distribution, not transmission. But what effectively they've done there is they've taken the burden of cost for demand connections off the customer. So if you've got a rural village that is off grid right now, you could ask for a connection. There is a kind of high price cap, but even at that, most projects will go forward, and all you would pay would be the point of connection to a substation. So maybe 10, maybe £100,000, but you certainly wouldn't pay the kind of what's probably previously been quoted £2 or £3 or £5 million on that. And for generation, you would only pay for the upgrade at your voltage level. So if you're going for an upgrade at 11 kV, you wouldn't pay for the 33 kV upgrades, which again, typical project could take £500,000–600,000 off of it. Doesn't apply to transmission and grid, but that's certainly for projects in rural, but also projects in urban where the network's congested, is a bit of a sea change. So I've put the link in, have a read at it if you have any further questions on it. But that really is to turn on its head every time you go for heat pumps, all of a sudden you're told, yeah, we don't have capacity there to reinforce that network, would cost £400,000, and you go, well, that's just put the project out of budget. That will no longer happen. So upgrades will be the DNO's responsibility, up to the distribution and transmission. Ofgem are speaking to transmission and grid to do something similar, but that's just started, so it'll probably take 2 or 3 years for them to get the same thing, to turn it on its head, to be seen as enabling small, rural and urban community projects to go forward. So a bit of a sea change. It starts from April the 1st next year.
Thank you. Are you able to send that link in the chat again, as people are asking where the information is?
Will do.
Oh, I think Kate's just sent it.
You got it?
Yeah. We have a question hear from, oh, Kate, did you want to come in there?
Sorry, no, that's a different link I've just.
Oh, that's a different link.
Yeah.
Okay, then so if you could send that one through as well.
Will do.
Christopher, I'll come to you in just a second. We've got one question in the chat here. What role does battery storage at scale have in terms of grid constraints and community ownership of them? I think this is slightly off from heating specifically, but does anyone have anything to add onto battery storage and grid constraints? Okay, so Kate's put one in there talking about transmission grid. Did you want to come in there, Kate?
I was just going to say, in terms of battery storage, I think a key problem that we have is that the distribution network operator and the transmission grid, they consider battery storage to be generation and storage. So everything and the link I put into the transmission grid is really useful because it shows what's queued up. So across the north, we've got 26 gigawatt queued, and that includes things like battery farms. But it's just seen as it's all added up installed capacity and considered to be queued. So we need to encourage Ofgem to think about how smart grids and when things are going to generate, not just a total installed capacity. So we're seeing this at the distribution network. We're having schemes turned down because of constraints at transmission. And we're kind of saying, well, we can work with the distribution network operator to look at smart local energy systems, solutions around flexibility and localized demand side management. And we really need to push Ofgem to encourage the DNOs to have bigger budgets, or get Ofgem to give them bigger budgets around innovation. Because at the moment we're being told by transmission grid you can't put anything on till maybe 2030, maybe 2033, maybe 2037, which clearly is not great for our net zero ambitions. So I think whatever pressure we can put on Ofgem to say, look, you know, we're here to try and find solutions at the grassroots, at that distribution network, you know, try and help us innovate.
There is an ENA group looking at that right now, I believe, because it was raised last week at one of our events. So we're trying to find some information on that and where they are with it. It's been going for a number of years, trying to reclassify battery as something different. But we also done a bit of work as well on, you know, batteries and generation can sometimes cause challenges with the fault level. So we do have some innovations. If you have been told that we have some real-time fault monitoring that can look at the peaks and troughs rather than theoretical max, and link that with active network management schemes to work with your technology, so it can say store right now, generate now, store, so it gives that smart signal. And we're under funding on that right now, so it might be rather cheap to do that. So if there's any projects out there, just let us know and we can at least talk about the technology we're doing on that. We are trying to support that. I think also in the significant code review, they're starting to look at development sites as not, you know, if you have generation and you have demand, then it's both. But what we're looking now is if it's net demand, then it's demand, and trying to treat it differently. Say, well, you know, the generation / battery will be contained, and if it has to come back up the system, it can be treated differently. So there are some moves to try and help it, but yeah, at transmission level right now across the country, it's very challenging. And it does take, you know, if they need to put in a new grid supply point, that could be 12 years in the making.
Thank you for that. So Christopher, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Diolch yn fawr, Izzy. Yeah, thanks. It's great conversation. I'm really delighted to be part of this process. There's some really fantastic projects on the go here. Just in terms, I think it's Emma from the Swaffham project. Is that right? Yeah. Amazing project, extraordinary the work that you've been able to achieve. I suppose a simple question is, how much salaried support have you had to get to the stage where you've gone through a whole sort of transitioning process with the council in terms of getting further grant aid and then eventually got a major capital grant? So what element of that has been driven by voluntary capacity and what element's been driven by employed members of staff capacity? Thanks.
Thank you. So to be honest, the first £20,000 grant was literally Mike and I, a guy in the village who I just happened to get talking to. He wanted to bring heating in. He worked for a Danish company about 10 years ago and failed. So he wanted to do district heating schemes back then. With his skill set, we cobbled together a tender process and we went out and we did some tenders and we got an initial report. And it's with that initial report, like the seed funding that report, we could then go forward to the next round of funding, which was 100,000. Now, all the funding has changed, but at the time, a community group was not allowed to go for the 100,000. You had to dovetail in with a county or a district council. And that's where we found our county council. Number one, they have a rural farm in our village, so it's their land. And number two, they have an energy team specifically set up to generate energy from county council assets. And I know that other counties are now trying to replicate that, but that was the unlocking for us, was the ability to partner with a team that purely deal in this type of project. They'd only done solar farms before, but they knew what they were talking about. And so they have taken the bid funding, they've had the project managers. We had to utilise their framework. So we unceremoniously, unfortunately, kicked Bioregional off the project, who've been working with us, because we had to go with Bouygues, who are a much bigger company on the framework. They've done a design, build and run contract. So, you know, that's super bulletproof in going forward. We've had really good people on the project. But it does take up a lot of volunteer time. I'm not going to lie. I juggle it in with the work job, the day job and everything else. And I'm banned by my kids for talking for old men in the pub about heating schemes, if I'm honest, because I can geek out quite a lot. But there is a really good point about this, and it is a really geeky point. Water running around the streets at the moment is not allowed to happen. You can put power into streets, into adopted highways, and this is the same for Wales and England because it sits under the same legislation. If you want to run water around the streets, unless it's the county council or the district council doing it, there is no licensing to permit other providers from doing that at the moment. And that's where a lot of community projects are going to come unstuck until the Energy Act comes in. Now, we spent a lot of our grant money on lawyers doing different things, but one is taking on the county highways department by the energy department, had to take them on because there's a case called Norfolk County Council versus Calagas, and it banned Calagas from running a district heat network in the adopted highway. And that is currently a problem, but the Energy Act will change that. But be under no illusions, electric can go in the highway. Any other form of wet system at the moment can't. And that will be a problem for a lot of people unless the district or the county back you up. It's a Local Government Act 1976. That cost a lot of money to know that one point, but I pass that on freely.
Thank you, Emma. I think that's all we have time for questions, which leads nicely on to talking about what's going to happen with the working group. If you do have more questions or more things you want to discuss, that can be brought here. So the plan for Community Energy Wales is to have a monthly Welsh community group that is for our members and others in Wales interested in exploring low carbon heating, but that we will also be partnering with across the nations for a cross-nation meeting. And our first working group will be a cross-nation meeting. So wherever you are in the UK, you're welcome to join this. Plans to have it at Wednesday, the 26th of October at 11 AM, so in a couple of weeks' time. Anyone who is in this meeting, who has signed up for this, will get information about that. So if you want to join, you can. If you have any other queries or anyone else who might want to join this working group, or topics that you would really like to cover, then you can email me, izzy@communityenergywales.org.uk, and I will put that in the chat for you. I just also want to say, as we're closing up, thank you so much everyone for coming today. Thank you for all of our speakers for your amazing presentations. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone here has as well. And yeah, hopefully we will see you in the working group at some point soon. Thank you again. I'll just put my email in the chat.